diverse life and achievements of Sir Charles Todd. I'm Rob Morrison, I'm patron of National Science Week, and I'm the MC and the chair for today's symposium. I should like, particularly at the start, to acknowledge the Todd descendants and family members, some 18 of them, particularly Julia Squires and her daughter Lisa from Brisbane, her sister Pippa from the UK, and Barry and Ola Todd and their niece Hannah Barry from Sydney. Rona Sacco, the coordinator of National Science Week SA, the chairs and representatives of the many societies involved with preparing and presenting the symposium, lecturers, professors and practitioners of the various Todd disciplines, John Zillman, former director of the Bureau of Meteorology for 25 years and president of the World Meteorological Association for 8 years, and other interstate visitors, and distinguished guests, which is all of you. This symposium grew out of the gathering of the Todd family descendants in Adelaide to celebrate the 140th anniversary of the completion of the Overland Telegraph. The Weather Bureau was asked to brief the family on the meteorological work of Sir Charles Todd, and in organising that event it was thought appropriate to discuss the other professional endeavours of Sir Charles, which resulted in 6 societies whose interests reflect his work being asked to contribute. And they are the Australian Computer Society, Telecommunications Special Interest Group, the Australian Meteorological Association, the Astronomical Society of South Australia, the Surveying and Spatial Sciences Institute, Engineers Australia, the Engineering Heritage Australia chapter of it, and the Philatelic Society of South Australia. Each of those is contributing a speaker, and they'll be joined by independent historians, Todd biographer Dennis Cryle, and Todd family member and South Australia, Rob Linn. It became obvious that this event would be very interesting to a wider audience, and so it was then decided to make it public, include it in the National Science Week program, and take advantage of this wonderful lecture theatre, made available to us through the generosity of the South Australian Research and Development Institute, for which we thank them. We're delighted to welcome you, the 150 attendees present, and we note with pleasure that Sir Charles still has a significant drawing power among the citizens of this state 105 years after his retirement. Now, a bit of housekeeping. Each speaker has been allotted 20 minutes, with a 30-minute coffee break at 10:30, or as close to that as we can make it, and a close at 1 o'clock, which puts us on a very tight schedule. I asked the speakers to be very disciplined in their timing. They'll be given a 3-minute and a 1-minute warning towards the end of their presentations. And in keeping with the celebration of Sir Charles Todd's great achievement in building the Overland Telegraph, that warning will be delivered with a Morse key. I will attempt. The Morse for 3 is... and 1 is, and I won't accept any criticism of my technique. I would ask the speakers when they come up, we've got a lot of microphones here. This one is to talk to you. This one is because we're recording the event and should be going on to the video. So please make sure that you collect the microphone from the previous speaker, put it in your top pocket, put that somewhere near your mouth. Is level all right for you? Round about there, and then get underway. Could I also point out that we'll do this at the, I think, the break for morning tea, but for those going to the Edinburgh Hotel, there is a warning message coming that you need to book. We've got the phone number here, and we'll alert you to that as coffee looms. But now let's proceed to our first speaker. Could I also do the usual prompt about my mobile phones, please? I realise I have not turned mine off, which I shall now do as I resume my seat. But our first speaker is Rob Linn, to give us a picture of Adelaide in the 1850s. Rob Linn completed his postgraduate work on the Australian pastoral industry and has lectured in Australian history in both the university and TAFE sectors. He's published more than 30 books, many articles and digital works. Rob's an executive councillor of the Royal Agricultural and Horticultural Society of South Australia and has an enduring link to rural Australia and its communities. Rob and his wife Jane run a history consultancy and have worked with government agencies and utilities, rural and regional communities, major corporations and families to produce high-quality historical works. Rob Linn.
Morning, from the Adelaide Hills, I couldn't help thinking as I was driving down the wet roads with cars going everywhere, trucks sliding off and such like, the phone goes off in the pocket. And as my wife Jane found out yesterday, there's a message from Telstra, and when you look it up, it's please go to this website to find out how to use phones safely while driving. How much do we have to blame Charles Todd for? Well, Charles and Alice Todd reached Adelaide on the 6th of November 1855 on board the Irene, and faced in their naivety a world they knew little about. They were only very recently married, and Charles had been appointed by the South Australian government as an astronomical observer and superintendent of the electric telegraph network that was then in its infancy. And he brought with him a fella to help set up the telegraph and all the equipment that would make it happen. But South Australia in 1855 was a very different place from what we see around us today. They actually had a new governor, Sir Richard Macdonald, who'd arrived. He was welcomed with great heart at Port Adelaide. His predecessor Henry Young had actually been booed from Port Adelaide. I thought nothing's changed. Adelaide Crows, Port Power. The Port Elliot Railway had been established during the year, the first of its type in Australia. Copper was booming at both Burra and Kapunda, and the Adelaide to Gawler Railway had been begun. So it was a time of enormous change and things going on that people didn't expect. But like all Australian cities and towns based on European planning models, Adelaide was unsophisticated, primitive, and even dangerous. The roads and streets were largely unfinished even at that time, and there were standing jokes about the level of summer dust and the quagmires in winter. Now, for those of you who have heard this joke before, I apologise, it has been around since 1847. It was said that in King William Street, in the height of May, the street was so boggy that it really worried the local inhabitants. And as one was walking down the road, he looked into the middle of King William Street to see a hat on top of a puddle. He went over, picked up the hat, and there's a head underneath. And he said, "Are you all right?" And the bloke said, "I'm okay, but it's the horse I'm worried about." That's how bad Adelaide was. No reticulated water supply, no deep drainage. And if you walk down North Terrace towards Holy Trinity Church, on your right you'd see vast piles of stinking garbage. Absolutely, it was called the odoriferous city, for those who didn't know it well. Adelaide's water supply at the time came from a huge pool in the River Torrens, which is where people with skin diseases happened to be bathing at the same time. It really doesn't bear thinking about for us today who live in a fairly sterile environment. So there was really little way that the citizens could escape from the searing heat of summer and the bitter cold of winter, for housing was rudimentary. In fact, over 90% of Adelaide housing at the time was of timber construction. Fires were so frequent that there were fears the whole city or town would go up in flames. It was also part of a colony, South Australia, that had just been through a massive depression in the 1840s, where finance was so short that the treasurer of the colony had to use his last sixpence to pay the public servants of the time. I think the bills have gone up a bit since then. But the financial hardships of the 1840s had been turned around by the discovery of copper at Kapunda and Burra. Nothing changes, does it? Nothing changes. At this time too, agriculture and pastoral pursuits were flourishing all throughout South Australia. The Adelaide Hills, lands towards Gawler and the southern districts around Wollonga were proving incredibly productive for agriculture, and vast amounts of wheat of quite exceptional quality was being grown there and shipped around Australia and the globe. It's actually worth considering as an aside that so little was known about the soil structure of South Australia at the time that within another 10 years those top farming lands would be totally exhausted, and to solve that problem the South Australian government would open lands further through the mid-north and the further north for farmers to move to, and they did. There was a mass exodus away from the Wollonga regions and such like. South Australia was also a place which had actually suffered under the discovery of gold in Victoria and New South Wales. So great was the exodus of the male population in 1851 and 52 that one bloke jokingly suggested that they put an enormous sign on Kangaroo Island with "To Let" on it. And I thought that was probably pretty fitting. But those people that marched off didn't all come back. The ones who did, on the whole, came back with very little or less than they went with. But the people who really succeeded out of the gold rushes were those in Adelaide who'd been flour millers or grocers or livestock producers and who'd sent their meat or their flour to the diggings, and they made a fortune. So South Australia got a little bit of benefit out of the gold rushes, but not a lot. By this time too, pastoralists that we were talking about earlier had established their flocks and herds on runs of enormous size. There were some 1.6 million sheep by 1855. You think about it, that's not bad production over the previous 2 decades. And these pastoralists were producing livestock for meat and other products and wool for export. And it was proving a very lucrative investment. By pursuing advanced thinking and importing stud animals from Europe, they'd begun to build up their herds to such a degree that many of them, and I mean this sincerely, did not know what to do with their money. They began investing in land interstate, which is what I think South Australians should always have been doing, by the looks. Particularly in the Riverina, around Deniliquin and Hay, vast amounts of South Australian money went into buying pastoral property in that region at this time. So 1855 is really a key time in which South Australian finance from the pastoral industry moved out of Adelaide into New South Wales in particular. Now 1855 was also a time of increased immigration to South Australia. It caused great debate and controversy. Again, nothing changes. But this was particularly to do with boatloads of single Irish women coming to South Australia. I see somebody's not surprised at all. Their skills, some of which were not confined to manual labour, and how they should be placed for employment in the community did cause enormous controversy. For instance, there were many country centres like Wollonga and Mount Barker that had female refuges for these immigrant girls, and they tended to be pick-up places pretty much. The other thing that really surprised me, and which I had forgotten until recently, was that 1855 was also the year in which Lola Montez visited Adelaide. Now, does that name mean anything to any of you? She was an actress with a dubious reputation that followed her around the world, one could say. The newspaper reports on her presence in mid-1855 were hilarious, because the first crowds that went to see her were predominantly male. Funny about that. Slowly but slowly over the weeks, the ladies felt that they could still be genteel and go and meet her, so they did. So female immigrants from Ireland and Lola Montez turned South Australia on its head. It was also a time of debate on other matters of importance, from the economy to education and to the role of church and state. I think I should add that Alice and Charles Todd were coming into a colony in which the heritage, particularly in religious terms, was vastly different from most other parts of the English-speaking world. South Australia had largely been settled by people of non-conformist or dissenting religious views away from the Church of England. Coupled with this, there was an active pursuit amongst many of them in England of political radicalism. So South Australians basically come from a group of people who just did not conform and who had pretty way out ideas. But what it meant was that when they came here, they all became conservatives. Well, not all, but many. It did, in fact, though, mean that South Australia was a place of enormous innovation, and that's one of the facets of life here that I think's remained unchanged. This is a very, very innovative place, and our heritage is incredibly innovative. So many ideas have come from here over the decades that people know little about, and we've produced some of the world's foremost scientists from here as well. It's been a place where people want to discover and investigate things. But in 1855, excuse me, as the local settlers also cheered on the triumph at Sebastopol in the Crimean War, Adelaide also had its problems. The criminal life here was more than people ever realised, and as was normal in South Australia, they based the crime mainly on the movement of ex-convicts from New South Wales and Victoria. And I found that to be something that goes on to this day, that there is a cultural leaning towards blaming everything that goes wrong here on the eastern states. In addition, the state of the original inhabitants was nothing short of appalling and was realised at the time. Despite the best intentions of settlers, some of whom did have them, the Aboriginal population was already suffering from the impact of smallpox that had come down the Murray-Darling Basin in the early 1830s, and the affliction of sexually transmitted infections from the settlers. Those illnesses had cut the Aboriginal population, we think, by as much as 70% in the previous 25 years. So as Charles and Alice Todd made their journey from Port Adelaide to the town of Adelaide, they would have seen a variety of landscapes, of villages and farms before they entered the outskirts of the parklands. The township they saw on the plains, sitting beneath the beauty of the Mount Lofty ranges, had its own beauty. But the Todds had a lot to learn about this land and those who lived there. It was perhaps fortunate that Charles and Alice were so well matched, and that Charles had the most pungent sense of humour and wit. They would need every ounce of laughter in the years to come, as their life became intertwined with the story of an emerging nation.